Mosul, northern Iraq, November 2004. The city was dying in the particular way that cities die during wars that have already been officially declared over, which is to say violently, and without any of the narrative clarity that official declarations are supposed to provide. The Second Battle of Fallujah was consuming the attention of American commanders and international media 300 kilometers to the south, and that attention was precisely the point. Because while the world watched Marines fighting street by street through a city that had become a symbol of everything the Iraq War was, or wasn't depending on your political perspective, Mosul was quietly unraveling in ways that would prove more consequential and more instructive about the nature of the conflict than any single battle, however spectacular. The insurgency in Mosul had a different character than Fallujah's open defiance, more patient, more organized, more deeply embedded in the social fabric of a city that had been the stronghold of the old regime, and that had watched the new order arrive with skepticism that was curdling into active resistance as the months passed and the promised reconstruction failed to materialize, and the de-Baathification policies stripped away the professional and administrative class that had kept the city functional for decades. It was a smarter insurgency, run by men who understood that sustainability mattered more than spectacle, who were building networks rather than holding territory, who were moving money and weapons and personnel through systems that looked like ordinary commerce and ordinary social life to anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking for. The American intelligence apparatus in northern Iraq had been trying to penetrate those networks for the better part of a year, with results that were genuinely mixed in ways that the official reporting consistently failed to capture. There were successes, sources developed over months of patient cultivation, patterns identified through the painstaking analysis of thousands of intercepted communications, organizational structures mapped with increasing confidence as the pieces accumulated into coherent pictures of how the enemy actually functioned. And there were failures, sources burned through careless handling or deliberate compromise, operations that were solid in planning and disastrous in execution, intelligence that turned out to be fabricated by informants who understood that Americans paid for information, and that the quality of information was harder to verify than its existence. The intelligence picture in Mosul in November 2004 was detailed enough to be actionable and ambiguous enough to be dangerous. A combination that was familiar to anyone who'd worked in this environment, and that required the kind of careful judgment that couldn't be reduced to procedures or checklists, no matter how many. Procedures and checklists were developed by staff officers who'd never had to make those judgments under fire. Sergeant Major David Reeves had been making those judgments for 11 years across 4 continents, and a collection of conflicts that ranged from the officially acknowledged to the officially non-existent. He was 41 years old, which was old for a serving Delta Force operator, and which represented a kind of institutional memory that the unit valued precisely because it was increasingly rare. He'd been in Delta for 8 years, had completed more direct action missions than he could accurately count without consulting records he didn't have access to, and had developed through that experience a set of instincts and frameworks for understanding operational situations that were reliable enough that his assessments were sought by commanders several levels above the rank his position formally warranted. He was sitting in the Joint Special Operations Task Force compound on the eastern edge of Mosul's airfield, studying satellite imagery of a residential neighborhood in the city's western Ghazlani district, when the information arrived that would set in motion the sequence of events that this story is about. The imagery showed nothing dramatic. Houses and streets and the ordinary visual vocabulary of urban life in a mid-sized Iraqi city that didn't distinguish itself from 1,000 other similar neighborhoods in similar cities. But overlaid on that imagery was a collection of intelligence reporting that told a different story about what that neighborhood actually contained. And Reeves was working through the implications of that reporting with a methodical attention to detail that 11 years of high-stakes operational work had made second nature. The intelligence suggested that a senior logistics coordinator for the insurgent network operating in Mosul's western districts had established a temporary base of operations in the Ghazlani neighborhood, using the home of a relative as a planning location for what signals intelligence characterized as a significant resupply operation, intended to move weapons and financing into the city before American forces completed the cordon they were building in anticipation of a clearing operation. The coordinator was identified in reporting under the source designation IVORY, a mid-level figure who'd been tracked across multiple intelligence streams for 6 months, whose identity had been confirmed through a combination of technical collection and human sources, and whose capture or elimination would degrade the insurgent network's operational capacity in ways that would last months rather than days. He was not the most important target in the Mosul insurgent hierarchy. He was not someone whose removal would change the fundamental trajectory of the conflict. But he was real. His location was assessed with reasonable confidence. And the window for acting on that location was narrow because the nature of his work required constant movement, and because the Americans had been close enough to him before to lose him when the opportunity slipped. Reeves had presented the intelligence package to the JSOTF commander that afternoon, had walked through the source reporting, the analytical assessment, the confidence levels attached to each element, and the proposed operation to act on the opportunity before IVORY moved again. The commander, a colonel named Peterson, who'd spent the previous 18 months building the intelligence architecture that had made this kind of targeting possible, had reviewed the package with the focused attention that Reeves had come to expect from him, and had asked the questions that demonstrated he understood both the opportunity and the limitations. Timeline, Peterson said, his finger resting on the imagery. How long do we have before he moves? Reeves had given the honest answer rather than the comfortable one, which was the only kind of answer Peterson accepted from his people. 48 hours at the outside, sir, probably less. The pattern of life on the source he's been using suggests he doesn't stay in any location more than 3 to 4 days. And the signal's intelligence indicates he arrived approximately 36 hours ago. If he follows his pattern, which these guys generally do, because habits are how people function under stress, he'll be gone by tomorrow night. Peterson had nodded. Processing the timeline against the operational planning requirements and the coordination demands that any direct action mission in Mosul required given the complexity of the operating environment and the number of coalition and conventional forces with equities in the city. British are going to have thoughts about this, he said, and the statement wasn't question or complaint but simple acknowledgement of operational reality. Get me a coordination call with SAS headquarters in the next 2 hours. The British Special Air Service Regiment had been operating in Mosul and northern Iraq for over a year, running intelligence-driven operation against the same insurgent networks that Delta Force was targeting. With a depth of human intelligence in the Sunni communities of northern Iraq that American forces had worked hard to match, and had not entirely succeeded in matching because the British approach to building local relationships was different from the American approach in ways that were more than superficial. The SAS operated under British chain of command, with British rules of engagement. and with British operational priorities that were aligned with American priorities at the strategic level. But that diverged in specific tactical situations, with enough regularity to make coordination not merely advisable but essential if the two forces were going to avoid working at cross purposes in the same operational environment. The coordination mechanism was a regular liaison process that involved embedded officers on both sides and a shared targeting board where proposed operations were deconflicted and where intelligence was pooled to develop the best possible picture of the operating environment. It was a system that worked reasonably well when both sides had time to work through it. And that created friction when operational timelines compressed to the point where the formal coordination process couldn't keep pace with the tactical situation. The call that evening with SAS headquarters in Mosul introduced the friction. The SAS liaison officer who took the call was a major named Carrick, a lean and precise man in his mid-30s who Reeves had worked with on 3 previous operations and whose professional judgment he respected even when their operational assessments diverged. Carrick listened to the Delta Force briefing on IVORY with the careful attention that Reeves had come to associate with him, asking clarifying questions at precise moments that demonstrated he was tracking the intelligence picture at a level of detail that suggested genuine analytical engagement rather than mere politeness. When the briefing concluded, there was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds before Carrick spoke, and in that pause Reeves felt the particular quality of silence that precedes a complication. "We have a problem," Carrick said, with the British precision that could make understatement sound like an accusation. "The source you're calling, IVORY, is an individual we've been in contact with for approximately 4 months, not as a target, as an asset." The silence on the American side of the call lasted longer than 10 seconds. Reeves felt the implications spreading outward from Carrick's statement like cracks in ice, each one connecting to others to form a pattern that changed the shape of the problem entirely. The manned Delta Force had developed as a target through 6 months of intelligence collection, whose location had been confirmed through multiple independent streams, whose capture or elimination had been assessed as a meaningful contribution to degrading insurgent capabilities in Mosul, was simultaneously being run as a British intelligence asset. The compound implications were significant and immediately apparent to everyone on the call, who understood how intelligence operations worked in complex environments where multiple agencies and multiple national forces were working against the same problem from different angles, with imperfect coordination and understandable reluctance to share information that might compromise their own sources and methods. If IVORY was a British asset, then the intelligence he'd been providing to American analysts for 6 months was intelligence that the British had channeled through him, which meant the picture American analysts had developed of the Mosul insurgent network was partly constructed from British-controlled reporting, which meant the confidence Americans had placed in that picture needed to be reassessed in light of what the British had chosen to share and what they'd chosen to withhold. And if IVORY was a British asset embedded in the insurgent network, then running a direct action mission against his location would either kill or capture a coalition intelligence source, burning a 4-month British operation and potentially compromising the network of contacts and relationships that the British had built around him over those 4 months. How deep is he? Reeves asked, because that was the question that mattered most immediately. How deeply embedded was IVORY in the British intelligence structure? What had he provided? What had been built on what he'd provided? And what would his removal cost in terms of ongoing intelligence collection against the Mosul insurgent network? Carrick's answer was measured and careful in the way that answers about sensitive intelligence programs are always measured and careful. giving enough to communicate the stakes without giving more than the situation required. He's a principal source in an active operation targeting the financial network that funds insurgent activity in western Mosul and across the northern provinces. Over 4 months, he's provided reporting that has allowed us to map the financial architecture at a level of detail we didn't have previously. The operation he's currently involved in, the one your signals intelligence has picked up, is a controlled delivery that we've been working to set up for 6 weeks. If your people move on his location tonight, you burn the operation, you burn him, and you burn the 6 months of work it took to get him to the point where he could deliver this operation. We've invested considerable resources and time in this asset and this operation, and the intelligence we expect to generate from it will be significantly more valuable than removing one logistics coordinator from the network. Carrick delivered this assessment without accusation or drama, with the professional directness that characterized his approach to difficult conversations. And Reeves listened to it with the professional respect it deserved while simultaneously running the calculation that any experienced operator runs when presented with competing legitimate priorities. The SAS Major's position was reasonable from a British intelligence perspective. The operation Carrick was describing was real, the investment was real, the expected intelligence value was real. But the JSOTF's position was also reasonable from an American direct action perspective. The window to act on IVORY's confirmed location was closing. The target represented a genuine operational opportunity, and the intelligence basis for the mission had been developed through legitimate means over a significant period. Colonel Peterson had joined the call by the time Carrick finished his assessment, and his voice carried the particular quality of a commander who has absorbed a complicated problem and is working through it in real time without the luxury of the deliberate analysis the problem deserved. Major Carrick, I understand the British position, and I respect the investment your people have made in this asset and this operation. I need to understand the timeline on your controlled delivery operation. When does it execute, and what's the probability it provides the intelligence you're projecting? The question was the right one, cutting directly to the operational variable that would determine how competing priorities should be weighed. If the British operation was executing in the next 24 hours and had high probability of delivering significant intelligence, the calculus for standing down the Delta Force mission was relatively straightforward. If it was executing in a week with lower confidence, the calculus was different. Carrick's response introduced the complication that made the situation genuinely difficult rather than merely complicated. The controlled delivery is scheduled for 72 hours from now. With confidence we assess at approximately 65%. The variables are on the insurgent side, not our side. IVORY has done everything we've asked of him. The uncertainty is whether the network accepts the delivery on the timeline we've established or delays for operational security reasons, which they do periodically. 65% confidence on a 72-hour timeline against a confirmed target location that would be valid for perhaps another 24 hours. The math was uncomfortable in the way that operational math is always uncomfortable when legitimate competing priorities are quantified against each other, and the numbers don't resolve cleanly into it. Obvious answer. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Peterson and Carrick working through the intelligence picture from their respective positions, each presenting the logic of their situation with the professional clarity that experienced officers bring to difficult discussions where the stakes are high and the easy answers have already been eliminated. Peterson pressed on confidence levels, on contingency planning, on what British forces would do if IVORY moved before the controlled delivery executed, and the American targeting opportunity was gone. Carrick pressed on what American forces knew about IVORY's immediate plans, on whether the signal's intelligence gave any indication that his operation posed an immediate threat that justified accepting the cost of burning the British asset, on whether there were alternative approaches to the American objective that didn't require direct action against IVORY's current location. Neither conversation partner was unreasonable. Neither was ignoring the other's legitimate concerns. They were two professional officers from allied nations, trying to navigate a genuine conflict between legitimate operational priorities in an environment where neither had complete information and both had responsibilities that couldn't simply be subordinated to the other's requirements. At the end of the conversation, no resolution had been reached. Peterson said he needed to consult with higher command before making a final decision. Carrick said he would do the same on the British side. Both acknowledged that the timeline was real and that a decision needed to be made quickly if either operation was going to proceed. The call ended with the professional courtesy that characterized British-American military relationships at their best, and with a complete absence of resolution that characterized those relationships when fundamental interests diverged. Reeves spent the 3 hours after the call studying everything the JSOTF intelligence section had on IVORY, looking for anything that would either confirm or complicate the British assessment that he was a controlled asset rather than a genuine insurgent target. The exercise was professionally necessary because intelligence environments produced fabrications with enough regularity that every significant claim required verification, and because the possibility that the British were protecting IVORY for reasons that had nothing to do with intelligence value and everything to do with operational politics couldn't be dismissed without examination. What he found was genuinely ambiguous in ways that didn't cleanly support either conclusion. The reporting attributed to IVORY through American collection channels was consistent with someone embedded in the insurgent logistics network in the way the British described. But it was also consistent with a genuine insurgent actor who happened to be in contact with information American collectors had successfully intercepted. The pattern of his movements as tracked through multiple intelligence streams showed the kind of systematic behavior that could reflect either a disciplined insurgent or a controlled asset. Because both required operating with careful attention to security, and both required maintaining genuine relationships within the network that created the operational necessity for movement patterns that looked similar from the outside. The ambiguity was not resolvable through available information, which meant any decision about how to proceed would have to be made with genuine uncertainty about which picture was accurate, an uncertainty that had serious consequences regardless of which direction the error went. If the British were right and IVORY was their asset, acting on the American targeting package would burn a coalition intelligence operation and set back British intelligence collection in northern Iraq by months, while damaging the trust that made joint operations between American and British special forces effective. If the British were wrong, or if IVORY was running both sides with the sophisticated dual reporting that experienced intelligence assets sometimes attempted, standing down would allow a genuine insurgent logistics coordinator to continue operating at a moment when the Mosul insurgency was actively trying to establish itself as a sustainable alternative to the deteriorating Fallujah-centric model. By midnight, the situation had developed in two directions simultaneously. On the American side, Peterson had consulted with JSOC headquarters and had received guidance that acknowledged the British concerns and directed him to seek further coordination before executing the direct action mission. While explicitly not prohibiting execution, if coordination failed to resolve the conflict within a defined time frame. The guidance was the kind of carefully calibrated direction that higher commands provide when they want subordinates to use judgment without taking responsibility for the judgment themselves, which was understandable given the sensitivity of the situation and infuriating given the operational pressure it left on Peterson and Reeves to manage. On the British side, Carrick had received his own guidance from SAS headquarters that was equally calibrated, affirming the importance of protecting IVORY and the controlled delivery operation, while acknowledging that the British could not prevent American forces from executing their own authorities against their own identified targets if the Americans determined that their operational requirements overrode the British concerns. Both sets of guidance, American and British, essentially said the same thing. This is your problem to solve at the tactical level because we are not going to solve it for you at the strategic level. The effect was to concentrate the decision on Peterson, with input from Carrick, at a moment when the tactical situation was developing faster than the coordination process could accommodate. At 0100 hours, new signals intelligence indicated that IVORY's location had received additional visitors in the past 3 hours, with electronic signatures suggesting the presence of at least 2 additional individuals whose communications profile was consistent with senior insurgent leadership rather than the logistics level, figures that IVORY typically interacted with. The intelligence was not conclusive. It could mean that a significant insurgent planning meeting was taking place at IVORY's location, which would represent an upgraded target value that changed the balance of the competing priorities considerably. It could mean that the British-controlled delivery was happening earlier than the 72-hour timeline Carrick had described, and that the new arrivals were elements of the operation Carrick was running. It could mean something else entirely that the intelligence picture didn't yet support. What it meant in practice was that the operational situation was changing faster than the coordination process was resolving, and that decisions were going to have to be made on the basis of incomplete and ambiguous information in a time frame that didn't accommodate the careful deliberation the situation deserved. Reeves called Carrick at 0115, not through the formal liaison channel, but on the direct line that experienced operators establish when formal channels are too slow for what the tactical situation actually requires. The call was different in character from the earlier coordination conversation, less formal, more direct. The kind of exchange between professionals who understand each other's constraints and are trying to find a workable path forward rather than win an argument. The SIGINT picture has changed, Reeves said without preamble. We're seeing additional presence at the location. I need to know if that's your operation moving early or something we don't know about. Carrick's response was quicker than Reeves expected, suggesting the British were watching the same picture through their own collection means and had been waiting for this call. It's not ours. We have no explanation for the additional signatures. Our last contact with the asset was 16 hours ago, and nothing indicated this development. The statement carried implications that both men understood immediately. If the additional presence at IVORY's location was not British-controlled, then either IVORY was meeting with insurgent figures independently of his British handlers, which suggested his intelligence value was more complex than the controlled asset picture implied, or the location had been compromised in some way that neither American nor British intelligence had tracked, which created a different kind of problem. Either way, the certainty that IVORY was simply a British asset whose location should be protected had just become more complicated, and the operational calculus that had seemed relatively clear, even if uncomfortable, was now genuinely uncertain in ways that made standing down less obviously correct than it had appeared 2 hours earlier. "We need to get eyes on that location," Reeves said, and the statement was both assessment and proposal, suggesting a course of action that would provide information without forcing an immediate decision about the direct action mission. Carrick agreed, and the next 90 minutes produced one of those improvisational joint operations that happen when experienced special operations forces from different nations find themselves working the same problem with resources that complement each other and professional trust sufficient to bypass the formal processes that would normally mediate their interaction. British assets in the Gazlani neighborhood provided ground-level observation, while American technical collection continued to track the electronic signatures at IVORY's location. The picture that emerged over those 90 minutes was detailed and disturbing in ways that neither American nor British planning had accounted for. IVORY's location was not a simple logistics meeting. The additional visitors were senior enough that their presence suggested something significantly more important than a routine resupply coordination. And the pattern of activity observable through the British ground assets suggested that the gathering had the character of decision-making rather than administrative function. The implications for the British-controlled delivery operation were serious in ways that Carrick was processing in real time, his assessments to Reeves becoming more clipped and precise as the picture developed. The careful professional understatement that characterized his communication style, compressing further as the operational situation pressed against the intelligence picture he'd been working from, and found it inadequate. At 02:45, Carrick said something that Reeves would remember for years, because it represented the kind of professional honesty that experienced operators display when they care more about getting the outcome right than protecting their prior assessments. Our picture of this asset may have been incomplete. The controlled delivery operation was built on assumptions about his role and his relationships within the network that this new information doesn't entirely support. I'm not in a position to tell you that the protection of this asset takes clear precedence over your operational requirements, given what we're currently observing. The statement was not authorization for the Delta Force mission. It was not withdrawal of British objection to that mission. It was an honest acknowledgement that the certainty that had underwritten the British position was less complete than it had appeared. An acknowledgement that created space for the American decision-making process without resolving the fundamental conflict between competing priorities. Peterson made his decision at 0300. After 30 minutes of consultation with Reeves and the JSOTF intelligence section, and a final call to JSOC headquarters that produced the same calibrated non-guidance as the previous call, which was the last call he made, before committing to a course of action that he knew would generate significant friction regardless of how the tactical situation resolved. The Delta Force assault element, 12 operators plus support personnel, had been in standby since the previous evening and had been following the developments through the Tactical Operations Center with the focused patience of people who have learned that the most important professional skill is the ability to remain prepared while waiting for decisions that others are making. The briefing was compressed to 15 minutes because the tactical picture had changed enough during the coordination process that the original planning assumptions needed updating, and because 15 minutes was approximately the right amount of time to convey critical changes to experienced operators who'd been tracking the situation throughout and who didn't need extensive explanation of context they already understood. The assault element's team leader, a master sergeant named Kowalski, who Reeves had worked with on 7 previous operations, absorbed the updated briefing with the attentive stillness that was his characteristic response to new information, his questions precise and operationally focused. His follow-up to Reeves's answers demonstrating that he was already projecting forward to the tactical situation he would encounter and the decisions he would have to make in the environment. "The British know we're going," Kowalski said, and the statement was question and acknowledgement simultaneously. Reeves confirmed that Carrick had been informed of the decision through the direct line, that British forces were being stood down from any potential response to the operation, and that the coordination picture, while not fully resolved, was sufficiently deconflicted that the assault element would not encounter British special forces operating in the same space. The coordination picture being sufficiently deconflicted was a careful formulation that both men understood carried more uncertainty than the phrase suggested. But that represented the honest state of coordination under the circumstances. And experienced operators learned to operate with honest uncertainty rather than false certainty, because false certainty got people killed. The movement to the target area was unremarkable in the way that professional military operations aspire to be unremarkable, which is to say that nothing happened that wasn't supposed to happen, and everything that was supposed to happen happened in approximately the right sequence, with approximately the right timing. Mosul at 03:30 in the morning was not empty, but was as close to empty as a city of that size ever became. The streets carrying the thin traffic of people whose work or circumstances required them to be out in hours when normal life was elsewhere. And the assault element moved through those streets in vehicles that were configured to blend with the commercial traffic that used the same routes at similar hours. The outer cordon was established without incident, the approach routes covered. The support elements positioned to respond to contingencies that planning had identified, and others that planning hadn't identified, but that experience suggested were always possible in urban direct action operations. Kowalski led the assault element to the target building's outer perimeter at 0400, and the minute's pause before the breach was the kind of silence that experienced operators inhabit differently from civilians, full of focused attention and calibrated readiness, rather than the fearful hesitation that civilians often imagine preceding violent action. What happened in the next 4 minutes would generate after-action reports, investigation, official correspondence between American and British commands, and the kind of informal conversation among special operations professionals that carries as much or more weight than official documentation in shaping how communities of practice understand what happened and what it meant. The breach was clean, the initial rooms cleared without contact. The movement to the primary target room on the second floor, accomplished with the precision that distinguished operations run by experienced professionals from operations run by merely competent ones. The room contained 5 men, 3 of whom matched description profiles in the targeting package, one of whom was immediately identifiable as IVORY from the imagery that American intelligence had developed, and one of whom was not in any American database, but whose physical description and demeanor suggested operational significance. The Delta operators restrained all 5 with the professional efficiency that physical dominance and systematic procedure produced, a process that took approximately 90 seconds and that produced no casualties and no significant physical altercation, because the 5 men in the room understood that physical resistance against this particular kind of intrusion was a form of suicide that served no purpose. In the moment that should have been operationally straightforward, the confirmation of 5 detained individuals in a room that matched the target intelligence, the situation became complicated in the way that operations in complex environments become complicated, which is suddenly and completely. IVORY, whose hands were zip-tied behind his back, and who was sitting against the wall with the 4 other detainees, said something in Arabic that the assault element's interpreter translated in real time as a specific phrase, identifying him as a British intelligence asset and requesting that American forces contact the SAS liaison before proceeding further. The phrase was specific enough in its formulation that it could only have come from someone who knew how to identify themselves to American Special Operations Forces in a way that would be recognized, which meant it was either a genuine recognition code that IVORY had been given by his British handlers for exactly this kind of contingency, or it was an extraordinarily sophisticated piece of deception that had been prepared in advance of the American operation, which would require a level of advanced knowledge about American targeting and a level of operational sophistication that was possible but not easily achieved. Kowalski made the call to Reeves at 0412, his voice carrying the controlled calm of a professional managing a situation that had developed outside the planning assumptions. He described what IVORY had said, described the other 4 detainees, described the materials in the room that his element had begun exploiting while the situation was managed. Reeves relayed the information to Peterson, who made the call to Carrick that the situation required, even though it was 04:15 in the morning, and even though making that call meant acknowledging that the Delta Force operation had proceeded despite British objections, which was a conversation that carried diplomatic weight that neither Peterson nor Reeves was looking forward to. Carrick answered on the second ring, which confirmed that the British had been monitoring the situation and were not surprised by the call even if the specific content of the information was new. The conversation was professional and brief, with Carrick confirming that the phrase IVORY had used was consistent with recognition procedures British forces used for exactly the kind of situation that had developed, that the British would send a liaison officer to the JSOTF compound immediately, and that the 5 detainees should be held for joint processing rather than being moved into the standard American detention pipeline until the British could review the situation and assess the implications. Peterson agreed to the joint processing request while noting that the other 4 detainees, who were not identified British assets, would be processed according to American procedures regardless of the British review of IVORY's status. Carrick did not object to this, which confirmed that the British position was specifically about IVORY rather than generally about the operation, a distinction that simplified at least one element of a situation that had very few simple elements. The next 6 hours, as dawn came to Mosul and the Tactical Operations Center processed what the night had produced, were occupied by the kind of professional reckoning that follows operations that achieve tactical objectives while generating institutional complications that would outlast the immediate operational situation by months or years. The intelligence exploitation of the materials recovered from IVORY's location produced a picture that was simultaneously more and less satisfying than either American or British planning had anticipated. More satisfying because the 3 individuals who were not IVORY and not the unidentified 5th man were confirmed insurgent figures whose detention removed operational capacity from the Mosul network in ways that were immediately apparent in subsequent collection. Less satisfying because the materials themselves suggested that IVORY's relationship with the insurgent network was more complex and more independent than the British-controlled asset picture had indicated, with written documentation that suggested he had been operating with a degree of autonomy from his British handlers that the British had either not known about or had not fully shared with their American counterparts. The unidentified 5th man was the most significant element of the exploitation picture because his identity, established through biometric processing and database matching, revealed him as a figure whose presence at the meeting suggested connections between the Mosul insurgent network and external support structures that American intelligence had been attempting to trace. For months, he was not the primary target, not IVORY, not any of the figures in the original targeting package. And his presence was the kind of operational windfall that direct action missions sometimes produced, and that could not have been planned for because his presence at the location was either coincidence or a development in the insurgent network that no one's collection had tracked in time to incorporate into planning. Carrick arrived at the JSOTF compound at 0630, and the conversation that followed between him and Peterson in Peterson's office, with Reeves present as the intelligence officer and operational planner, most directly involved in the preceding 24 hours, was the kind of professional reckoning between Allied officers that happened when operations produced outcomes that were neither simple success nor simple failure, but something more complicated that both sides needed to understand accurately. The British major sat across from the American colonel and the American sergeant major with the composed expression of a professional who had spent the preceding 2 hours preparing himself for this conversation and who was going to conduct it with the honesty it required regardless of how uncomfortable that honesty was. "You proceeded with the operation despite our objections," he said. And the statement was neither accusation nor question, but simple acknowledgement of established fact that served as the starting point for a more substantive discussion. Peterson's response was equally direct. "We proceeded with the operation because the tactical situation developed in ways that undermined the certainty underpinning your objection, and because our operational authorities gave us the ability to make that determination. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Carrick nodded, accepting the statement not as agreement but as honest representation of what had actually happened. What the exploitation materials indicate is that our picture of this asset was incomplete in ways that have implications for the reliability of the reporting he provided over the previous 4 months. That's a British problem to work through, and we will work through it. What I need to understand from an operational coordination standpoint is whether there are mechanisms we can establish that would prevent this kind of conflict from developing in future operations. Because this won't be the last time American and British forces are working against the same individuals from different directions. The shift in the conversation from what had happened to what should happen going forward was the kind of professional move that experienced operators make when dwelling on past friction is less useful than preventing future friction. And Peterson recognized and accepted the shift as the right way to handle a situation that had been managed imperfectly, but not catastrophically. The answer to Carrick's question was complicated because the structural factors that had produced the conflict were not easily resolved through additional coordination mechanisms, however well-designed those mechanisms were. The fundamental issue was one that ran through all coalition special operations in complex environments, and that no amount of liaison architecture or shared targeting process could fully resolve, because it was rooted in the different operational cultures and national intelligence equities that made coalition special operations simultaneously more capable and more complicated than unilateral operations. American direct action doctrine prioritized action on confirmed targets within defined timelines, with a bias toward execution that reflected the American military's historical emphasis on operational tempo and the recognition that intelligence windows closed faster than coordination processes. Moved. British Special Operations Doctrine emphasized the patient development and exploitation of intelligence sources and relationships, reflecting a longer historical experience with irregular warfare and a more explicit recognition of the intelligence costs that direct action missions extracted from the human networks that sustain. Collection over time. Neither approach was wrong in an absolute sense. Both were optimized for genuine aspects of the operational problem that the other approached less effectively. The conflict between them was not a conflict between competence and incompetence, or between good judgment and poor judgment, but between legitimate operational philosophies that were genuinely incompatible when they converged on the same individual in the same time frame, with the same resources, and competing conclusions about what that individual's status and value required. The coordination mechanisms they developed in the days following the operation were improvements over what had existed before. Clearer procedures for flagging potential conflicts between direct action targeting and ongoing intelligence operations. Faster escalation paths for situations where resolution was needed in hours rather than days. And a joint intelligence cell that was supposed to catch these conflicts before they developed into operational crises, by ensuring that both sides were working from the same baseline understanding of key individuals in the targeting environment. Whether those mechanisms would prevent future conflicts similar to this one was genuinely uncertain. The structural factors that had produced the conflict were not eliminated by better procedures. They were managed more effectively, which was a real improvement but a different thing from a solution. For IVORY, the outcome was decided through the joint processing that Carrick had requested and Peterson had agreed to. A process that took 4 days and involved intelligence analysts from both American and British services reviewing his history as a source, the completeness and accuracy of his reporting, and the implications of the materials recovered from his location for understanding his actual role in the insurgent network. The conclusion was ambiguous in ways that probably reflected reality more accurately than a clean determination would have. He had been providing genuine intelligence value to the British operation, while simultaneously maintaining relationships within the insurgent network that were more independent and more operational, significant than his handlers had known. A dual existence that was not uncommon among intelligence assets embedded in active conflict environments, and that created genuine uncertainty about the degree to which his information had been reliably representative of what he actually knew. He was released after 4 days, having provided American interrogators with information that was assessed as genuine and significant, and returned to a status that was neither fully trusted asset nor confirmed adversary, but something in the middle that intelligence professionals recognized as the operational reality for many of the human sources who sustained collection in complex environments, where the lines between sides were drawn less clearly than official categories suggested. The British-controlled delivery operation was suspended pending reassessment, which in practice meant it was abandoned because the network relationships that had made it possible had been disrupted by the detention of the 3 confirmed insurgent figures and by IVORY's own calculation, whatever that calculation was, about whether his position in the network was sustainable after 4 days in American custody. The intelligence windfall from the unidentified 5th man's detention proved more significant in retrospect than it appeared in the immediate aftermath of the operation, contributing to a series of subsequent operations against the external support network that American intelligence had been tracking, a contribution that complicated the simple assessment of whether the operation had been worth the British-American friction it produced, because that friction had costs that were real and immediate. While the intelligence contribution was real, but distributed over subsequent months in ways that made attribution difficult. Sergeant Major Reeves filed his portion of the after-action review 3 weeks after the operation, working through the established framework for capturing lessons from direct action missions, while trying to write about what had happened in ways that were honest about the complexity without, obscuring the operational decisions in bureaucratic language that made them easier to process but less accurate. He'd written hundreds of after-action reports over his career and had developed considerable skill at navigating the tension between institutional documentation requirements and the need to capture operational reality in forms that were actually useful for learning. This one was harder than most, not because the tactical execution had been particularly complicated, but because the operational and institutional dimensions of what had happened resisted the kind of clean narrative that after-action reports were designed to contain. He wrote about the intelligence conflict honestly, acknowledging that the British concerns had been legitimate and professionally presented, that the decision to proceed had been made on the basis of genuine uncertainty rather than dismissal of those concerns, and that the outcome was ambiguous in ways that didn't resolve cleanly into validation of either the American or British position. He wrote about the coordination mechanisms that had been established and his assessment of their likely effectiveness, which was measured rather than optimistic because his experience with coordination mechanisms across multiple coalition operations had taught him that they improved specific processes without changing the fundamental incentive structures that produced the conflicts those processes were designed to manage. The most honest part of his report, the part that he rewrote 3 times before settling on language that captured what he was trying to say without overstating it, addressed what the incident revealed about the nature of coalition special operations in environments where the intelligence picture was genuinely ambiguous and where different national forces were optimizing for different aspects of the same operational problem. He wrote that the night had not demonstrated that either American or British special operations forces had made a wrong decision, because wrong decisions were identifiable as such by their divergence from correct ones. And in this case, there wasn't a clearly correct decision that both sides could have reached if they'd communicated better or coordinated more thoroughly. The conflict had emerged from genuine incompatibility between legitimate competing priorities, and the resolution that had been achieved was less a conclusion than a management of ongoing tension that would continue to produce similar situations as long as coalition forces operated in complex environments with different operational cultures, different intelligence equities, and different national